In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1885, when a mere mention of Apache warriors could make grown men reach for their rifles, one man's simple act of kindness would either save his life or seal his doom. Thomas Mackenzie never imagined that offering food to two starving Apache women would lead to the most terrifying and extraordinary 72 hours of his life. Picture this: a lone rancher, miles from the nearest settlement, facing down 700 mounted Apache warriors who had surrounded his small ranch house. The air thick with tension, war paint gleaming in the desert sun, and the sound of horses snorting and stamping echoing across the valley. This is not a Hollywood fantasy. This is the true story of how compassion in the face of fear changed everything. What happened next would become legend, whispered around campfires and retold in saloons across the American Southwest. But the real story is far more incredible than any tale ever spun. Thomas Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked across his small ranch in the Arizona Territory. The year was 1885, and life out here was harder than anything he had known back in Missouri. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dry earth, and the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away. But Thomas had come west seeking freedom and opportunity, and despite the challenges, he was determined to make his ranch work. He had built his modest home and barn with his own hands, using timber hauled from the distant mountains and adobe bricks made from the desert soil. His cattle, though few in number, were healthy and strong. Water was scarce, but he had been lucky enough to find a small spring on his property that provided just enough for his needs. Every day was a struggle against the elements, but Thomas found satisfaction in the honest work. The Apache Wars had been raging across the territory for years. Stories of raids and battles reached even his remote location through occasional travelers and supply runs to town. Most settlers lived in constant fear, keeping their rifles close and their eyes on the horizon. Thomas was no different. He slept with his Winchester beside his bed and never ventured far from the ranch house without being armed. On this particular morning in late September, Thomas was mending a fence when he noticed movement in the distance. Two figures were approaching on foot, moving slowly across the desert landscape. As they drew closer, he could see they were women, and from their clothing and appearance, they were Apache. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but something about their manner made him pause. The women were clearly exhausted and struggling. One was supporting the other, who appeared to be injured or ill. Their clothes were torn and dusty, and they moved with the desperate slowness of people who had been walking for days without adequate food or water. Thomas found himself facing a decision that would change his life forever. Everything he had been taught about the Apache told him to be afraid. The newspapers were full of stories about Apache raids, about settlers killed and property destroyed. The territorial government had placed bounties on Apache scalps, and most white settlers viewed all Apache as dangerous enemies. But looking at these two women, Thomas saw only human beings in desperate need of help. The larger of the two women was tall and strong-built, with long black hair braided with leather strips. Even in her weakened state, she carried herself with dignity and pride. Her companion was smaller and younger, perhaps in her 20s, and it was clear she was seriously ill. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and she was burning with fever. As the women reached the edge of his property, the larger woman called out in broken English. "Water," she said simply, pointing to her companion. "Please, water." Thomas stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Helping Apache could be seen as treason by other settlers. If word got out, he might be branded an Apache sympathizer or worse. But the woman's plea was so simple and desperate that his humanity overcame his fear. He set down his tools and walked slowly toward them, his hands visible and empty of weapons. "Come," he said, gesturing toward his house. "Water inside." The relief on the larger woman's face was unmistakable. She spoke rapidly in Apache to her companion, who managed a weak smile. Thomas helped support the sick woman as they made their way to the ranch house. Inside his modest home, Thomas quickly drew water from his pitcher and offered it to both women. The sick one drank eagerly but carefully, while the larger woman sipped more slowly, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Thomas could see she was assessing whether this was a trap, looking for hidden dangers or other people who might pose a threat. He gestured for them to sit on his simple wooden chairs and began gathering what food he had available. His supplies were limited, but he had dried beef, beans, and some hardtack biscuits that would provide nourishment. As he prepared a simple meal, he tried to communicate with the women. "I am Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. The larger woman nodded and touched her chest, saying something in Apache that sounded like Ayana. She then indicated her companion and said what might have been Siki. As the women ate, Thomas learned through gestures and broken English that they had been traveling for many days. Ayana made sweeping motions with her arms that seemed to indicate they had come from far to the south. Siki was clearly very ill, and Ayana was desperate to find help for her. Thomas had some basic medical supplies, and he brought out what he could to help. He had aspirin powder that might help with Siki's fever, and clean cloth for bandages. As he tended to the sick woman, he realized that Ayana was watching his every move with intense scrutiny. She was evaluating not just whether he could be trusted in this moment, but whether he was the kind of person who could be trusted with something much more important. Through the afternoon, as Siki rested and her fever began to break, Ayana began to open up more. Her English was better than she had initially let on, and Thomas began to understand more of their situation. They were not just random travelers. They were on a specific mission, though Ayana was careful not to reveal too much. As evening approached, Thomas faced another decision. The women clearly needed more than just a meal and a drink of water. Siki was too ill to travel, and both women needed rest and proper food to recover their strength. But allowing Apache to stay overnight on his property was an enormous risk. Thomas had heard stories of Apache using such situations as setups for larger attacks. The women could be scouts, gathering information about his defenses and resources before reporting back to warriors who might return in force. But looking at Siki, who was still weak and feverish, and at Ayana, who had shown nothing but gratitude for his help, Thomas decided to trust his instincts. "Stay tonight," he told Ayana. "She needs rest." He pointed to Siki and then to his own bed. "Sleep here. I sleep outside." Ayana's eyes showed surprise and something deeper, a recognition that this white man was showing a level of trust and kindness that was rare in these times of conflict. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Thomas thought he heard emotion in her voice, though he could not understand the words. That night, as Thomas bedded down in his barn with his rifle close at hand, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Every sound in the darkness made him alert. Every movement of his animals caused him to reach for his weapon. But nothing happened, and as dawn broke over the desert, he found the two women still resting peacefully in his house. Over the next 2 days, as Siki gradually recovered her strength, Thomas learned more about his guests. Ayana was indeed a woman of importance among her people, though she was careful about revealing exactly what her status was. Siki appeared to be her younger sister, and the bond between them was clearly very strong. Thomas shared his simple meals with them and tended to Siki's illness with the limited medical supplies he had. In return, Ayana helped with work around the ranch, showing skills with animals and understanding of desert survival that impressed Thomas. Despite the language barrier, they began to develop a mutual respect. On the third morning, Siki was clearly much improved. Her fever had broken completely, and she was able to walk around without assistance. Thomas knew that the time had come for them to continue their journey, whatever it might be. As he prepared breakfast for what he assumed would be their last meal together, Ayana approached him with a serious expression. She spoke carefully in her limited English, choosing her words with great deliberation. "You good man," she said. "You help when you get hurt. This Apache remembers." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. "You needed help. Anyone would have done the same." Ayana shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone. Most white eyes see Apache, see enemy. You see people." She paused, seeming to struggle with how to express something important. "My people will know. They will remember Thomas, who helped Ayana and Siki." The women prepared to leave that morning, but before they departed, Ayana did something that puzzled Thomas. She gathered several small stones from around his property and arranged them in a specific pattern near his front door. She also broke a branch from a mesquite tree and stuck it in the ground nearby in a particular way. When Thomas asked about this, Ayana smiled. "Apache sign," she said, "says Thomas is friend. Apache who see this know." Thomas watched as the two women walked away across the desert, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. He felt good about what he had done, but he also felt uneasy. In helping them, he had crossed a line that few white settlers would have crossed. He could only hope that his act of kindness would not bring him trouble. For several weeks after their departure, life returned to normal at the ranch. Thomas continued his daily routines of caring for his cattle, maintaining his property, and making occasional trips to town for supplies. He told no one about his Apache visitors, knowing that such news would likely cause panic and possibly bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. But Thomas began to notice small signs that suggested he was being watched. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of movement in the distant hills. Sometimes his cattle would react as if they had sensed something, though Thomas could see nothing. Once, he found footprints near his water source that were not his own. Rather than feeling threatened by these signs, Thomas found himself oddly comforted. He remembered Ayana's words about Apache remembering kindness, and he began to suspect that her people were keeping an eye on him, perhaps ensuring his safety rather than planning his harm. This suspicion was confirmed one morning when he found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from a post near his barn. There was no note, no message, but the meat was still warm and had been cleanly killed with an arrow. Someone had been watching his property closely enough to know his routines and had left him a gift. Thomas began to understand that his simple act of compassion had earned him something precious in this harsh land: the protection and respect of people who were feared throughout the territory. But he had no idea that this protection was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The autumn days were growing shorter, and Thomas was preparing for the challenges of winter when his quiet life was about to be shattered forever. The sound that would announce the beginning of his greatest trial was already echoing across the distant mesas, though he did not yet know it. Hundreds of Apache warriors were riding toward his small ranch, and his fate hung in the balance of the kindness he had shown to two desperate women. The first sign that something extraordinary was about to happen came on a crisp October morning when Thomas noticed his cattle acting strangely. The animals were bunched together at the far end of his property, their heads all turned toward the southern hills. Their behavior was nervous and alert, as if they sensed something approaching from a great distance. Thomas climbed onto the roof of his barn to get a better view of the surrounding landscape. From this vantage point, he could see for miles across the desert valley. What he saw in the distance made his blood run cold. A massive dust cloud was rising from the southern horizon, too large and sustained to be caused by wind or a small group of travelers. As the hours passed, the dust cloud grew larger and closer. Through his field glasses, Thomas began to make out individual shapes moving within the cloud. Horses. Many horses with riders. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus and tried to count the approaching figures. 10, 20, 50, 100. The numbers kept growing until he stopped counting altogether. Thomas had lived on the frontier long enough to know what a large group of mounted Apache looked like from distance. The way they moved, the spacing between riders, the purposeful direction of their travel, all indicated a war party of massive proportions. But they were headed directly toward his ranch, and there was nowhere for him to run. His first instinct was to saddle his horse and ride hard for the nearest town, which was a full day's journey away. But as he watched the approaching riders, he realized that escape was impossible. They were coming from the south, and the only route to town would take him directly toward them. Any attempt to flee would likely result in him being run down in the open desert. Thomas climbed down from the barn and began to prepare his property for what might be his final stand. He checked his weapons: a Winchester rifle with 2 boxes of ammunition, a Colt revolver with a dozen extra cartridges, and an old shotgun that had belonged to his father. The weapons felt inadequate against what appeared to be hundreds of warriors, but they were all he had. He moved his most valuable possessions into a wooden crate and buried it near the spring, hoping that if he did not survive, perhaps someone might eventually find his few treasures and know that Thomas Mackenzie had lived here. He wrote a brief letter explaining who he was and what had happened, sealing it in an oiled cloth and placing it with his buried belongings. As the day wore on, the dust cloud drew steadily nearer, and Thomas could begin to hear sounds carried on the desert wind. The thunder of many hooves, the occasional call of a rider to his companions, the jingling of metal equipment. The sounds grew louder and more distinct with each passing hour. Thomas positioned himself on his front porch, his rifle across his knees, and waited. He thought about his life, his decision to come west, the family he had left behind in Missouri. He thought about Ayanna and Siki and wondered if his kindness to them had somehow brought this massive war party to his door. Perhaps they had reported his location to their people, marking him as a target for revenge or plunder. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, the first Apache riders appeared at the edge of Thomas's valley. They emerged from the southern pass in small groups, spreading out as they entered his property. From his porch, Thomas could see them clearly now, and the sight was both terrifying and magnificent. The warriors were painted for war, with red and black designs covering their faces and bodies. Their horses were decorated with feathers and painted symbols, and many of the riders carried traditional weapons alongside captured rifles and pistols. They moved with the fluid coordination of men who had spent their entire lives on horseback. But what struck Thomas most was their sheer number. Wave after wave of riders continued to pour into his valley until the entire southern portion of his property was filled with mounted Apache. He had never seen so many warriors in one place, and the realization of how completely outnumbered he was settled over him like a heavy blanket. The warriors did not immediately advance toward his house. Instead, they spread out in a vast semicircle, effectively surrounding his buildings while maintaining a distance of several hundred yards. Thomas counted more than 20 distinct groups, each containing what appeared to be 30 or 40 riders. His earlier estimate of hundreds had been accurate. There were at least 600 or 700 Apache warriors arranged across his property. As darkness fell, the Apache lit fires throughout their encampment. The flickering flames illuminated painted faces and gleaming weapons, creating a scene that looked like something from Thomas's worst nightmares. But still, no one approached his house. The warriors seemed content to wait, though for what, Thomas could not imagine. Thomas spent that night on his porch, dozing fitfully in his chair with his rifle ready. Every sound made him alert. Every movement of shadow near the fires caused his finger to move toward the trigger. But the hours passed without incident. The Apaches seemed to be waiting for something, and their patience was both puzzling and unnerving. As dawn broke over the valley, Thomas got his first clear view of the massive encampment that surrounded him. In the morning light, the Apache warriors looked even more numerous and formidable than they had the night before. Their horses grazed peacefully on the sparse desert grass, and many of the men were eating breakfast around their fires, as if this were a normal camping trip. But Thomas noticed something that had not been visible in the darkness. Near the center of the Apache encampment, a large teepee had been erected during the night. It was more elaborate than anything Thomas had seen before, decorated with painted designs and hung with feathers and other ornaments that suggested it belonged to someone of great importance. As the morning progressed, Thomas saw increased activity around this central teepee. Warriors came and went, often staying inside for extended periods before emerging to speak with others. It appeared that some kind of council or meeting was taking place, and Thomas began to suspect that his fate was being decided by Apache leaders who were discussing what to do with him. Around midday, movement began in the Apache camp that suggested something significant was about to happen. Warriors mounted their horses and began to form organized groups. But instead of preparing for an attack, they seemed to be arranging themselves for some kind of ceremonial or formal gathering. A group of about 20 riders separated from the main encampment and began to approach Thomas's house. They rode slowly and deliberately, with one warrior carrying what appeared to be a lance decorated with feathers and strips of cloth. As they drew closer, Thomas could see that the riders were older men, clearly leaders or elders rather than young warriors eager for battle. Thomas stood up from his chair and stepped to the edge of his porch, his rifle held ready, but not pointed directly at the approaching riders. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm and alert. This was the moment he had been waiting for since the Apache first appeared. The riders stopped about 50 feet from the house and sat motionless on their horses for several minutes. Thomas could see their faces clearly now, and he was struck by the dignity and gravity of their expressions. These were not wild savages as portrayed in newspaper stories, but serious men conducting serious business according to their own customs and traditions. Finally, one of the riders urged his horse forward a few more steps and called out in English that was heavily accented but clearly understandable. "Thomas Mackenzie," he said. "We come to talk." The fact that they knew his name was both surprising and somehow reassuring. It suggested that this was not a random attack, but something more purposeful and personal. Thomas took a deep breath and replied, "I am Thomas Mackenzie. I will listen." The Apache leader nodded and spoke again. "You helped Apache women, Ayana and Siki. You gave food, water, medicine. You asked nothing. You showed kindness when you could have shown fear or hatred." Thomas felt a surge of relief and understanding. This was indeed connected to his encounter with the two women weeks earlier. But the presence of so many warriors still puzzled him. "I helped people who needed help," Thomas replied. "Anyone would have done the same." The Apache leader shook his head. "No, Thomas Mackenzie. Most white eyes would not help Apache. Most would shoot first, ask questions after. You chose different path. This is why we come." Another rider moved forward and began speaking rapidly in Apache to the leader. Thomas could not understand the words, but the tone seemed urgent and serious. The leader listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or making brief comments. When the conversation in Apache ended, the leader turned back to Thomas. "My people have talked much about Thomas Mackenzie, who helped Ayana and Siki. Some say white man's kindness is trick, that you help Apache women to learn our secrets or to gain our trust for bad purpose. Others say your kindness was true from the heart." Thomas began to understand the situation more clearly. The massive gathering of warriors was not necessarily a war party come to attack him. Instead, it seemed to be some kind of test or trial related to his treatment of Ayana and Siki. The Apache had come to determine for themselves whether his kindness had been genuine or calculated. "I helped them because they needed help," Thomas said simply. "They were hungry and thirsty, and one was sick. I would hope that if I were in such a condition, someone would help me regardless of the color of my skin or my people." The leader studied Thomas's face for a long moment before speaking again. "Ayana is daughter of great chief. Siki is daughter of war leader. You helped daughters of important Apache without knowing who they were. This means your kindness was not because you hoped for reward or feared punishment." The revelation that he had unknowingly helped the daughters of Apache leaders explained much about the current situation. Thomas had stumbled into the middle of something far more significant than he had realized. His simple act of compassion had created ripples that had spread throughout Apache society. "We have come to see with our own eyes what kind of man helps Apache daughters," the leader continued. "Some of my warriors say we should test you with fire and pain to see if your kindness is real or if it disappears when you are afraid. Others say a man's actions when he thinks no one is watching tell more about his heart than what he does when many eyes are upon him." Thomas realized that he was facing a trial unlike anything he could have imagined. Hundreds of Apache warriors had gathered to pass judgment on him based on his treatment of two strangers in need. The outcome of this trial would determine not just his fate, but possibly the nature of future relations between his Apache neighbors and the white settlers in the region. "What would you have me do?" Thomas asked. The leader smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "For now, nothing but what you have already done. Tonight, our chiefs will counsel. Tomorrow, we will speak again. But know this, Thomas Mackenzie, you have shown that not all white eyes have hearts of stone. This is something worth knowing." As the group of riders turned to rejoin the main encampment, Thomas felt a mixture of hope and continued anxiety. He was not yet safe, but neither was he doomed. The Apache had come not as enemies, but as judges, and his trial was just beginning. That second night, as Thomas again kept watch on his porch, he could see the fires burning throughout the Apache encampment and hear the sounds of what appeared to be lengthy discussions. His fate was being debated by some of the most powerful Apache leaders in the territory, and all he could do was wait for their decision. The second dawn brought a dramatic change to the Apache encampment. Where before there had been casual activity and routine camp life, now there was purposeful movement and formal preparation. Warriors painted their faces with fresh designs. Leaders donned elaborate headdresses and ceremonial clothing, and the entire gathering took on the atmosphere of a significant tribal event. Thomas watched from his porch as a large circle was formed in the open area between his house and the main Apache encampment. Warriors arranged themselves in precise formations, with the most senior leaders and chiefs taking positions that clearly indicated their status and authority. The elaborate teepee that had been erected the previous night was now open, revealing ornate decorations and artifacts that spoke to its importance. As the morning progressed, Thomas began to recognize some faces among the assembled Apache. Near the center of the gathering, he spotted a familiar figure, Iona, the larger of the two women he had helped. She was dressed in beautiful traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and appeared to hold a position of honor among the assembled people. Beside her sat a man who could only be her father, distinguished by his elaborate headdress and the deference shown to him by other leaders. The sight of Iona gave Thomas both comfort and concern. Her presence confirmed that this gathering was indeed related to his earlier encounter with the two women, but it also emphasized the magnitude of what had occurred. He had not simply helped two travelers. He had aided the daughters of Apache royalty, and now he faced judgment from what appeared to be a council of the most powerful Apache leaders in the entire Southwest. Around mid-morning, a group of young warriors approached Thomas's house. Unlike the dignified delegation of the previous day, these men had the bearing and energy of fighters. Their leader, a man perhaps 30 years old with scars that spoke of many battles, called out in broken English, "White man, you come now. Chiefs want to see you close." Thomas understood that the time for waiting was over. He checked his weapons one final time, not with any intention of fighting. Such an action would be suicidal, but simply from habit and the comfort of feeling prepared. Then, he walked down from his porch to meet the warriors who would escort him to face Apache justice. The walk across the open ground toward the Apache gathering felt longer than the actual distance. Thomas was acutely aware that hundreds of eyes were watching his every step, evaluating his demeanor, his courage, his worthiness. He forced himself to walk steadily and calmly, showing neither defiance nor fear, but simply the dignity of a man facing whatever fate awaited him. As he reached the edge of the great circle, the assembled Apache fell silent. The only sounds were the wind across the desert, the occasional snort of a horse, and the soft jingling of metal ornaments on clothing and equipment. Thomas had never experienced such complete and focused attention from so many people, and the weight of their collective scrutiny was almost overwhelming. An elderly Apache man rose from his position near the center of the circle. His age was evident in his white hair and lined face, but his bearing was that of someone accustomed to absolute authority. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the gathering despite his advanced years. "Thomas Mackenzie," he said in English that was much clearer than Thomas had expected, "I am Cochise, son of the great chief for whom I am named. I speak for the Chiricahua Apache, and my words carry the authority of our people." Thomas felt a chill of recognition at the name. Cochise was legendary throughout the territory, a leader whose very name struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. To be standing before such a man was both terrifying and strangely honor-giving. "You are brought before this council because your actions have created questions that must be answered," Cochise continued. "You helped Apache women when you could have turned them away or harmed them. This kindness has been reported to all our people, and we have come to understand what manner of man you are." Thomas waited for permission to speak, unsure of the proper protocol in such a situation. Cochise seemed to understand his uncertainty and gestured for him to respond. "I helped them because they were people in need," Thomas said, his voice carrying farther across the silent gathering than he had expected. "I would hope that others would show the same kindness to me if I were in such circumstances." Cochise nodded slowly. "These are good words, Thomas Mackenzie. But words are easily spoken. We must know if your heart matches your words." At Cochise's signal, Iona rose from her position and walked toward the center of the circle. When she spoke, her voice was strong and clear, and Thomas was surprised by how much her English had improved since their first meeting. "This man gave me food when I was hungry, water when I was thirsty, medicine for my sister when she was sick," Iona announced to the gathering. "He asked for nothing. He took nothing. He sent us away with full stomachs and grateful hearts. He could have killed us and claimed bounty money from the white soldiers. Instead, he showed us kindness." Murmurs rippled through the assembled Apache as Iona's words were translated for those who did not understand English. Thomas could see various reactions on the faces around him, some showing approval, others remaining skeptical, still others appearing thoughtful or curious. Another figure rose from the circle, a younger man with the bearing of a war leader. When he spoke, his words were harsh and challenging. The white man shows kindness to two Apache women when he is alone, and they are weak, he said in accented but clear English. But what does he do when he faces many Apache warriors? Does his kindness remain, or does it become fear and hatred? Thomas understood that this was the core of his trial. The Apache needed to know whether his kindness had been genuine or simply circumstantial. They wanted to test whether he would maintain his respectful attitude when facing a position of disadvantage and potential danger. Cochise raised his hand for silence and addressed Thomas directly. Nantan here speaks wisdom. It is easy to show kindness when you are strong and others are weak. It is harder to maintain good heart when you are the one who is outnumbered and vulnerable. The old chief paused and seemed to study Thomas's face carefully before continuing. We have a proposal for you, Thomas Mackenzie. We will test your heart in the Apache way, and your response will determine not only your fate, but how our people remember you. Thomas felt his mouth go dry, but he managed to speak steadily. What would you have me do? You will spend 3 days among us as our guest, Cochise announced. You will eat our food, sleep in our camp, and live as one of us. If your kindness was true, you will show us the same respect you showed Ayana and Siki. If your kindness was false, you will reveal your true feelings when you are surrounded by those you fear. The proposal was both a relief and a new source of anxiety for Thomas. He would not be harmed immediately, but he would be subjected to an extended test under the watchful eyes of hundreds of Apache warriors. Any sign of fear, disgust, or hostility on his part would be noted and judged. I accept, Thomas said without hesitation. He understood that refusing the test would be seen as an admission of false motives, while agreeing to it demonstrated confidence in the sincerity of his earlier actions. Cochise smiled approvingly. Good. But know this, we will watch everything you do. How you eat our food, how you treat our horses, how you speak to our children, how you behave when you think no one is looking. Apache eyes see much, and Apache memory is long. As if by prearranged signal, several warriors came forward to escort Thomas to a place that had been prepared for him within the Apache camp. But before he left the formal circle, Cochise spoke once more. One more thing, Thomas Mackenzie. Among my warriors are men who have lost family to white soldiers, men who have seen their children killed and their women taken captive. Some believe that all white men are enemies who can never be trusted. Your behavior in the next 3 days will either confirm their beliefs or challenge them. Choose your actions wisely. The weight of responsibility that settled on Thomas's shoulders was immense. He was not just being tested as an individual, but as a representative of his entire race. His behavior would influence Apache attitudes toward white settlers for potentially generations to come. Thomas was led to a spot near the center of the camp where a simple shelter had been erected for him. It was basic, but comfortable, and its location allowed him to observe the daily life of the Apache community while ensuring that he remained constantly visible to his hosts. As the first day progressed, Thomas began to understand the complexity of the test he faced. The Apache did not simply watch him passively. They actively engaged with him in various situations designed to reveal his true character. Children approached him with curiosity and playfulness, testing whether he would show kindness to Apache young ones as he would to white children. Elderly Apache offered him food that was unfamiliar, watching to see if he would accept it graciously or reject it with disgust. Warriors invited him to observe their weapons and horses, gauging whether he showed appropriate respect for their skills and possessions. Each interaction was a small trial within the larger test. Thomas quickly realized that his survival depended not just on being polite or non-threatening, but on demonstrating genuine respect and interest in Apache culture and people. On the first evening, as he sat around a fire sharing a meal with a group of Apache families, Thomas found himself in conversation with an elderly woman who spoke excellent English. She had been watching him carefully throughout the day, and her questions were probing and intelligent. White soldiers killed my husband 20 years ago, she told him matter-of-factly as they ate. They said he was raiding, but he was hunting deer to feed our children. How do I know you are different from those soldiers? Thomas considered his answer carefully, knowing that this was another crucial moment in his trial. I cannot answer for what other men have done, he said finally. I can only be responsible for my own actions. I have never killed anyone who was not trying to kill me, and I have never harmed someone who came to me seeking help. The woman studied his face in the firelight before nodding slowly. Apache judge people by what they do, not by what they say. So far, your actions have been good. As the first day of his test came to an end, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary situation in which he found himself. He was living peacefully among hundreds of Apache warriors who had every reason to hate and distrust white men. Yet through his simple act of kindness to two women in need, he had earned the opportunity to prove that not all white settlers were enemies. But the test was far from over, and Thomas knew that the next 2 days would bring new challenges and opportunities to either confirm or destroy the fragile trust he was building with his Apache hosts. The fate hanging in the balance was not just his own, but the future relationship between two peoples who had been locked in conflict for decades. The second day of Thomas's trial began before dawn, when he was awakened by the sounds of the Apache camp stirring to life. Warriors tended to their horses, women prepared morning meals, and children played games that taught them skills they would need as adults. Thomas had slept surprisingly well despite the unusual circumstances, perhaps because exhaustion had finally overcome his anxiety. As he emerged from his simple shelter, Thomas was approached by a group of young Apache men who gestured for him to follow them. They led him to a stream that ran along the edge of the valley, where many of the Apache were performing their morning ablutions. Without words, they indicated that he should join them in washing and preparing for the day. This seemingly simple activity became another test of Thomas's character. The Apache watched to see if he would participate in their customs or hold himself apart as superior. Thomas understood the significance and joined them at the stream, washing alongside Apache warriors as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One of the young men, who introduced himself as Joaquin, began talking with Thomas as they prepared for the day. Joaquin had learned English during a period when he had been captured by soldiers as a boy, and his command of the language was excellent. "You are not what we expected," Joaquin told Thomas as they walked back toward the main camp. "Most white men who come among us are either soldiers trying to kill us or officials trying to lie to us. You seem to be neither." Thomas appreciated the directness of Joaquin's observation. "I'm just a rancher trying to make a living and stay out of trouble. I never expected to find myself in the middle of all this." He gestured at the massive encampment around them. Joaquin laughed. "Apache life is full of unexpected things. Our people say that a man's true character only shows when he faces the unexpected. So far, you have done well." As the day progressed, Thomas found himself drawn into various activities that revealed different aspects of Apache life and culture. He observed warriors training with traditional weapons and was impressed by their skill and dedication. He watched women working with leather and beads, creating beautiful and functional items with techniques passed down through generations. But the most significant event of the second day came when a genuine emergency arose in the camp. A young Apache boy, perhaps 8 years old, was kicked by a horse and suffered a serious injury to his leg. The child's bone was clearly broken, and he was in severe pain. Thomas had gained some medical knowledge during his years on the frontier, having dealt with injuries to himself and his animals when no doctor was available. When he saw the injured boy, his instinct to help overrode any concern about the political implications of his actions. Without waiting for permission or invitation, Thomas approached the group gathered around the injured child. The boy's mother was crying, and several Apache men were discussing what could be done. Thomas knelt beside the boy and gently examined the injury. "I've set broken bones before," he told the gathering, speaking to anyone who might understand English. "On horses and cattle, and once on a man who broke his arm falling from a roof. I think I can help." Joaquin translated Thomas's words, and an intense discussion ensued among the Apache adults. Some seemed willing to accept his help, while others appeared suspicious of allowing a white man to treat one of their children. The debate continued for several minutes while the injured boy continued to cry in pain. Finally, the child's father, a stern-looking warrior named Nate, made a decision. Through Joaquin, he told Thomas, "If you can help my son, I will be grateful. If you make him worse, I will hold you responsible." Thomas understood the gravity of the situation. This was not just a medical emergency, but another crucial test of his character and competence. If he succeeded in helping the boy, it would demonstrate that his desire to help others extended beyond the specific circumstances of his encounter with Ayana and Siki. If he failed, it could be seen as evidence that his earlier kindness had been meaningless. Working carefully and methodically, Thomas set the boy's broken leg using techniques he had learned from a doctor in Missouri years earlier. He fashioned splints from pieces of wood and used cloth torn from his own shirt to secure them. Throughout the process, he talked gently to the child in English, his tone conveying comfort even though the words were not understood. The boy's pain lessened noticeably once the bone was properly set and secured. His crying stopped, and he even managed a small smile when Thomas gave him a piece of hard candy he had been saving in his pocket. The relief on his parents' faces was obvious, and Thomas could see that his actions had made a positive impression on the assembled Apache. But Thomas's day was far from over. Word of his successful treatment of the injured boy spread throughout the camp, and other Apache began bringing him various medical problems. An elderly man had a persistent cough that Thomas treated with willow bark tea. A woman had a badly infected cut that Thomas cleaned and bandaged with honey as an antiseptic. Each medical case became an opportunity for Thomas to demonstrate his character. He could have refused to help, claiming that he was not a doctor and should not be held responsible for the outcomes. Instead, he approached each person with the same compassion and skill he had shown the injured boy. As evening approached on his second day in the Apache camp, Thomas was summoned to another formal gathering. This time, the circle was smaller and more intimate, consisting primarily of senior chiefs and war leaders. Cochise sat at the center, with Ayanna and her father flanking him. Thomas Mackenzie, Cochise began, "Today you helped an Apache child who was hurt. You did not ask what you would receive in return. You did not wait to be asked. You simply saw a person in pain and acted to help. This tells us much about your heart." Thomas felt a warm glow of satisfaction, but Cochise was not finished speaking. However, the old chief continued, "Tomorrow will bring a different kind of test. Today you showed kindness to our wounded. Tomorrow you must show us how you respond to our strength. You will hunt with our warriors and face the dangers of the desert with Apache men. This will complete our understanding of who Thomas Mackenzie truly is." The prospect of participating in an Apache hunt was both exciting and intimidating for Thomas. He was a competent outdoorsman and a fair shot with a rifle, but hunting with Apache warriors would require skills and stamina he was not sure he possessed. That evening, as Thomas prepared for his third and final day of testing, he was approached by Nate, the father of the boy whose leg he had set. Nate spoke no English, but he communicated through gestures and expressions that conveyed deep gratitude. He presented Thomas with a beautifully crafted Apache knife, its handle decorated with intricate beadwork. Through Joaquin, who acted as translator, Nate explained the significance of the gift. He says this knife belonged to his father, who was a great warrior. By giving it to you, he makes you a brother of his family. It is a high honor, and it means that he trusts you with his life and the lives of his children. Thomas was deeply moved by the gesture and the trust it represented. He accepted the knife with appropriate solemnity and tried to express his gratitude through Joaquin's translation. As the second night in the Apache camp drew to a close, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary experiences of the past 2 days. He had been accepted into the daily life of a people he had been taught to fear and mistrust. He had seen their kindness to their children, their skill in crafts and warfare, their deep connection to the desert landscape that was their home. More importantly, he had discovered that his own capacity for kindness and respect was not limited by racial or cultural boundaries. The same impulses that had led him to help Ayanna and Siki were still present when he faced an injured Apache child or an elderly woman with a cough. But Thomas knew that the most challenging part of his trial was yet to come. The hunt plan for the following day would test not just his character, but his competence and courage. He would need to prove that he could function as an equal partner with Apache warriors in one of their most important traditional activities. As he settled down for his third night in the Apache camp, Thomas wondered what the next day would bring. The outcome of the hunt would likely determine not just how the Apache remembered him, but whether he would be allowed to return safely to his ranch or would face a different fate entirely. The sounds of the Apache camp gradually quieted as the evening progressed. Guards took their positions around the perimeter, horses were secured for the night, and families gathered around dying fires for final conversations before sleep. Thomas found himself surprisingly comfortable in this environment that should have been alien and threatening. Perhaps most remarkably, he realized that he was no longer thinking of these people as Apache in the abstract, threatening sense that the word had always carried in his mind. Instead, he was beginning to see them as individuals. Joaquin with his quick humor and perfect English, Nate with his fierce love for his injured son, the elderly woman who had lost her husband to soldiers but was still willing to judge Thomas by his own actions rather than the actions of other white men. This shift in perspective was perhaps the most important outcome of his trial, regardless of its ultimate conclusion. Thomas was learning that the boundaries between us and them were far more permeable than he had ever imagined, and that kindness and respect could bridge even the deepest cultural and historical divides. Tomorrow's hunt would be the final test, but in many ways, Thomas had already passed the most important examination of all. He had proven to himself that his capacity for human compassion was not limited by the artificial categories that society had taught him to accept without question. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas dreamed not of the dangers that might await him in the morning, but of the surprising friendships he had begun to form with people who had started the week as strangers and potential enemies. Whatever the next day might bring, he knew that his life had been fundamentally changed by these 3 days among the Apache. The third and final day of Thomas's trial began before sunrise with the sound of horses being prepared for the hunt. Apache warriors moved through the camp with quiet efficiency, checking weapons, adjusting saddles, and making the countless small preparations necessary for a successful expedition into the desert wilderness. Thomas was awakened by Joaquin, who brought him a simple breakfast of corn cakes and dried meat. "Today you hunt with Apache warriors," Joaquin explained as Thomas ate. "This is not a game or ceremony. We hunt because our people need meat for the winter. You will be expected to contribute like any other warrior." The responsibility was clear, and Thomas felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. This would not be a symbolic or ceremonial test, but a real hunting expedition where his performance would directly impact the welfare of the Apache families in the camp. Thomas was provided with a horse for the hunt, a sturdy paint gelding that showed signs of excellent training and care. As he saddled the animal, he was approached by several Apache warriors who would be his hunting partners for the day. They spoke little English, but their gestures and expressions indicated that they were evaluating his horsemanship and general competence. The hunting party consisted of about 30 men, led by a war chief named Victorio, who was renowned throughout the territory for his tactical brilliance and courage. Victorio had observed Thomas carefully during the previous 2 days, but had said nothing to him directly. Today would be their first real interaction. As the hunting party prepared to depart, Cochise appeared to offer final words to the group. He spoke in Apache to the assembled warriors, and Thomas could only guess at the content of his speech. But when Cochise turned to address him directly in English, his words were clear and significant. "Thomas Mackenzie, today you hunt not as our captive or our guest, but as a member of this hunting party. Your success or failure will affect the food that Apache children eat this winter. Hunt well, and remember that Apache eyes are watching not just your skill, but your heart." The hunting party rode south from the camp, moving across terrain that became increasingly rugged and challenging as they traveled away from Thomas's valley. The Apache warriors demonstrated riding skills that Thomas had never seen equaled, guiding their horses across rocky slopes and through narrow canyon passages with seeming effortlessness. Thomas found himself working hard to keep up with the pace set by his Apache companions. His horse was excellent, but it required all of his frontier riding experience to match the performance of men who had been born in the saddle. Gradually, however, he found his rhythm and began to feel more confident in his ability to contribute to the hunt. The first test came when the party encountered the fresh tracks of a small herd of deer. Victorio called a halt and gathered the hunters around him to plan their approach. Through gestures and a few English words from Joaquin, Thomas began to understand the strategy that was being developed. The deer were feeding in a canyon about 2 miles ahead, with water at its bottom and steep walls on either side. The Apache plan was to divide into 3 groups. One would drive the deer toward the canyon mouth, another would position themselves to block the deer's escape route, and the third would wait in ambush at a narrow point where the animals would be forced to pass. Thomas was assigned to the ambush group, along with Victorio and 5 other experienced hunters. This was clearly the most critical part of the operation, requiring patience, skill, and perfect timing. The fact that he had been chosen for this group, rather than relegated to the less demanding role of driving the deer, showed that the Apache were willing to trust him with significant responsibility. The ambush position was reached after an hour of careful movement through brush and rocky terrain. The hunters concealed themselves behind boulders and scrub oak trees, with clear lines of sight to the narrow passage where the deer would appear. Thomas found himself crouched next to Victorio, who studied him with the intense gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating potential allies and enemies. "You shoot rifle good?" Victorio asked in heavily accented English. Thomas nodded. "Yes, I shoot well enough." Victorio gestured toward the passage where the deer would appear. "One shot maybe. Miss and deer gone. Apache family's hungry." The pressure was enormous, but Thomas appreciated the directness of Victorio's communication. This was not about impressing anyone or passing an abstract test. This was about putting meat on the table for people who needed it. The wait for the deer seemed to stretch for hours, though Thomas knew it was probably less than one. The desert was completely silent except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of wind through dry grass. Thomas forced himself to remain motionless and alert, knowing that any movement or sound could spoil the carefully planned ambush. Finally, the distant sounds of the deer drive began to reach their position. Thomas could hear the calls of Apache warriors and the sound of disturbed brush as the deer were moved toward their location. His heart rate increased, but he forced his breathing to remain steady and controlled. The first deer appeared in the passage exactly where Victorio had predicted it would. A magnificent buck with a full rack of antlers stepped carefully through the narrow opening, clearly sensing danger, but unsure of its source. Behind him came several does and younger animals, all moving with the nervous energy of creatures that knew they were being hunted. Victorio raised his rifle, a modern Winchester that had probably been captured from soldiers, and took careful aim at the leading buck. Thomas positioned his own rifle and selected a large doe as his target, knowing that a missed shot at the buck would alert all the animals and possibly ruin the entire hunt. The sound of Victorio's shot echoed off the canyon walls, and the big buck dropped immediately. Thomas fired a split second later, and his doe stumbled and fell. Around him, other Apache hunters were also shooting, and within moments 4 deer lay dead in the passage while the survivors fled back the way they had come. But the hunt was not over. The driving party had successfully turned the remaining deer, and they were now approaching the second ambush position where another group of Apache hunters waited. Thomas could hear the sound of more shots as the second phase of the hunt played out. When the shooting finally stopped, the hunting party had successfully taken 8 deer, enough meat to feed the entire Apache camp for several days. Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction and pride, not just because his shot had been successful, but because he had contributed meaningfully to the welfare of the Apache families. As the hunters gathered to field dress the deer and prepare them for transport back to camp, Thomas found himself working alongside Apache warriors as an accepted equal. They showed him techniques for efficiently processing the meat and commented approvingly on the placement of his shot. The barriers that had seemed so insurmountable just 3 days earlier had dissolved in the shared accomplishment of a successful hunt. The return journey to camp was triumphant, with the hunting party singing traditional songs and displaying the results of their efforts. Thomas rode among them, no longer an outsider being tested, but a participant in their success. When Joaquin rode up beside him and said, "You did good today, brother," Thomas felt a warmth of acceptance that was deeper than anything he had experienced in years. The hunting party's return to camp was greeted with celebration. Women and children gathered to examine the deer and praise the hunters for their success. Thomas found himself surrounded by Apache families expressing gratitude not just for his individual contribution, but for his willingness to work alongside their men as an equal partner. That evening, as the camp feasted on fresh venison, Cochise called for another formal gathering. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different from the somber trials of the previous days. Warriors spoke and laughed freely. Children played around the edges of the circle, and the mood was one of celebration rather than judgment. When Cochise rose to speak, the camp gradually fell silent. The old chief's words would determine Thomas's fate and, more importantly, establish the precedent for how Apache people would remember this extraordinary encounter. 3 days ago, we came here to test Thomas Mackenzie, Cochise began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. We wanted to know if a white man's kindness to our daughters was real or false. We wanted to see if his good heart would remain when he was surrounded by Apache warriors instead of commanding from a position of strength. The chief paused and looked directly at Thomas before continuing. We have seen this man eat our food without complaint, help our injured children without being asked, and hunt alongside our warriors without fear. We have watched him when he thought no one was looking, and we have seen that his kindness comes from his heart, not from calculation or fear. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering, and Thomas felt a mixture of relief and deep emotion at the chief's words. Therefore, Cochise announced, the Council of Chiefs has decided that Thomas Mackenzie will be known among all Apache people as a friend and brother. Any Apache who encounters him will know that he has been tested and found to be a man of good heart. He will be under the protection of our people, and any who harm him will answer to us. The formal declaration was followed by an extraordinary ceremony. Thomas was presented with gifts from various Apache families, a beautifully woven blanket, a pair of decorated moccasins, a horse bridle made of the finest leather, and adorned with silver conchos. Each gift represented not just material value, but acceptance into the extended family of the Apache Nation. But the most significant moment came when Ayanna approached him with a special gift. She carried a coup stick, a traditional Apache weapon used to count coup on enemies in battle, that had been specially made for Thomas. The stick was decorated with feathers and painted symbols, and Ayanna explained its significance through Joaquin's translation. She says this coup stick tells the story of your 3 days among us, Joaquin explained. The symbols show your kindness to Apache women, your help to our injured child, and your success in the hunt with our warriors. Any Apache who sees this stick will know immediately that you are a friend and ally. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration continued into the night, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred. 3 days earlier, he had been a lone rancher facing what appeared to be certain death at the hands of hundreds of Apache warriors. Now he was an honored member of their community with friends and allies throughout the most feared tribe in the Southwest. The next morning, as the Apache prepared to break camp and return to their various territories, Thomas was faced with a choice. Several of the chiefs invited him to travel with them, to see more of Apache country and to continue learning their ways. But Thomas knew that his place was at his ranch, and that his new relationship with the Apache would be most valuable if he remained in his role as a bridge between two worlds. As the massive encampment dissolved and groups of Apache riders departed in different directions, Thomas found himself saying goodbye to people who had become genuine friends in just 3 days. Joaquin promised to visit the ranch whenever his travels brought him through the area. Nate presented Thomas with additional medical supplies, asking him to continue helping anyone who needed care regardless of their race or tribe. But it was his farewell to Cochise that carried the most weight. The old chief took Thomas aside for a private conversation that would influence the rest of his life. Thomas Mackenzie, Cochise, said, "You have shown us that white men and Apache can live in peace when they treat each other with respect. This knowledge is valuable beyond measure. Use it wisely." The chief paused and seemed to be considering his next words carefully. "There will come times when our people and your people are angry with each other. There will be those on both sides who say that peace is impossible. When those times come, remember these 3 days. Remember that Apache and white men can hunt together, eat together, and protect each other's children." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding that Cochise was charging him with a responsibility that extended far beyond his own safety and welfare. As the last of the Apache riders disappeared into the desert distance, Thomas stood alone on his property for the first time in 3 days. His ranch looked exactly the same as it had before the Apache arrived, but everything had changed. He was no longer an isolated settler living in fear of his native neighbors. He was now a man with friends and allies throughout Apache territory, and with a story that would be told around Apache campfires for generations to come. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas's relationship with the Apache continued to develop. Warriors would occasionally stop at his ranch for water or food, always leaving gifts in return. Apache families traveling through the area would seek him out for medical help, knowing that he would provide care without prejudice or payment. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas became an unofficial ambassador between the Apache and the white settlements in the region. When tensions arose, both sides would sometimes seek his counsel, knowing that he understood and respected both cultures. His small ranch became a place where Apache and white people could meet safely, breaking down barriers of fear and mistrust one conversation at a time. The story of Thomas Mackenzie and his 3 days among the Apache became legend throughout the Southwest, but the real legacy was the lasting friendships and mutual respect that grew from one man's simple decision to help two strangers in need. In a time and place where racial hatred seemed inevitable, Thomas had proven that kindness and courage could create connections that transcended all boundaries. Years later, when Thomas was an old man telling his story to his grandchildren, he would always emphasize the same lesson: that the measure of a person's character was not determined by the color of their skin or the culture of their birth, but by their willingness to see the humanity in others and to act with compassion when compassion was needed most. The Apache never forgot Thomas Mackenzie, and he never forgot them. Until the end of his days, he kept the coup stick that Ayanna had given him, and he wore the moccasins that had been crafted by Apache hands. They reminded him daily that some of the most important lessons about humanity could only be learned by stepping outside the boundaries of one's own world and discovering the common ground that connected all people, regardless of the differences that seemed to divide them.